So welcome to the webinar on difficult group experiences and how to maintain relational safety. My name is Roxanne Thorstad. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'll be presenting today with my husband, Terry Thorstad, who's a counselor. We've enjoyed working together both as clinicians and in the Mending the Soul ministry, and in order to do that well, we've recognized the importance of relational safety and managing even our own conflict.
That is very true, Roxy. I always feel safe with you, except when we're in the middle of coals and you have a lot of coals bucks.
Oh, boy.
I feel very unsafe.
And probably rightly so.
Yeah, but absolutely, we have a great relationship, and I think we can always use some work. But in this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the difficult things that we have to kind of navigate through, just like you would in any relationship. So the groups really recreate a family dynamic, and that's where we're going to start. They can be a real positive reflection of a healthy family. Where each person has their voice, the individual is valued. They can be natural and organic and be themselves, and nurturing and caretaking. And so we want to really kind of promote this in order to, have that emotional safety in the group.
The difficulty comes, though, when groups represent an unhealthy family dynamic. They can be negative. We see this in work settings and church settings. And if you honestly can't think of any unhealthy family dynamics in either of those two settings, consider kids' sports settings.
Oh, yeah.
Where you see lots of different things come out in terms of conflict or competition or defensiveness. And really, this is what we're trying to prevent in a Mending the Soul group. So our goal is really that they recreate a healthy family dynamic that allows for someone to share their story very safely.
And now we're going to talk about some red flags that we really need to pay attention to. And we'll discuss what to do about them a little later on, but let's just list them out here. When a participant misses multiple times, someone is triggered by another person in the group, a conflict arises, someone talks about hurting themselves or others, someone becomes unsafe in the group, either physically or emotionally, or someone is actively using drugs. I have a story about that. And then someone talks too much or too little. And those are some of the talkers there.
So I would just encourage you to consider a recent group experience you've been in. And this can really be any kind of group, a small group, a Bible study, a school group, hobbies, anything really. And what you'll do in your notes is reflect on what was difficult about the group dynamic, either one listed here or another one that comes to mind, and write that experience down in your notes.
Yeah. So,
So what we'd like you to do after you consider that group experience is just notice your feelings during that unhealthy conflict, maybe what some of your body responses were and what it reminds you of in your personal history. And once you orient yourselves to your notes, just go ahead and pause the webinar to record your thoughts, feelings, and responses on your journal page. Go ahead and pause the video now. Well, welcome back. We'll be coming back to that group experience later, and you'll notice that you're going to be recording a lot of your thoughts and feelings throughout all of these webinars, and we know that you'll appreciate that as you continue to process. In this next section, we're just going to be looking at how to address conflict. And to do that, we have to sort of at least understand first the difference between unhealthy conflict and healthy conflict. In unhealthy conflict, you see a lot of different things. You might see overtly aggressive behavior, blaming others, shouting, physical posturing, kind of in-your-face stuff, threatening even. But you might also see it in a different way with passive behavior. Maybe that's complete avoidance of content or somebody walking out of the room. In a group setting, you might see somebody dropping out of the group after conflict without addressing it at all. And then you can also have kind of a combo platter, as Terry likes to call it, passive aggressive. This is really not a direct aggressive behavior, but it's really behind the scenes anger along with some other types of behaviors. Maybe that's showing up late, getting up to go to the bathroom after someone shares. And it just really creates a lot of unhealthy feelings and tension in a group setting.
Yeah, and this is where the co-facilitators really helps out. you're picking up on this unhealthy behavior, and maybe the co-facilitator, your buddy there, your partner, is not picking up on it, or vice versa. And so we just have to recognize that we have these blind spots when it comes to unhealthy conflict, and a lot of times it's subtle, like we're talking about. So having that person to kind of bounce things off of is really important.
Yeah, and I think for co-facilitators too, understanding what your biggest triggers are is really important, because you are going to have a group of 6 different people, 6 different personalities, and you never know when you might be triggered by somebody. I can tell you for myself, my biggest trigger is somebody who's aggressive and directly challenging. So I have to work pretty hard to find ways to stay engaged when somebody starts to communicate that way. And I've gotten better at it over the years, recognizing that that's what happens. But I think up front, if I'm co-facilitating a group, I will let my co-facilitator know if somebody's giving me a direct challenge or kind of posturing or whatever, any chance that you could take over on that one. And that's a nice combo.
Yeah, that's well said. My biggest trigger is when one member is not being sensitive to another member, and maybe that's me just kind of being oversensitive and kind of, wanting to protect the underdog sort of part of me. But I just, it drives me crazy when I see somebody sort of maybe overpowering another person or talking over another person, body language, maybe grunts, sort of, after they say something, just that flat out verbal disrespect and even sarcasm really triggers me. So it's really important that we understand those parts of us that might be triggered, during a group.
Do you have ways that you've been able to manage that in the past?
I'm a pretty direct person, so I tend to use humor in groups, and so in a subtle, graceful, humorous way, I might say something. But if they're not catching on, there's definitely a need to sort of pull them aside, either before the next group or after that group, and just kind of process it with them. Where's that coming from? Is there something in that person that's triggering you? Maybe we need to be understanding on how some of these things, although seemingly subtle or unintentional, could be harmful.
Yeah, I love your point about using humor as a way to kind of set a boundary or kind of redirect the group. And oftentimes we think humor is almost always harmful because it maybe deflects from real emotion or something serious. But sometimes humor can be used in a very lighthearted way that helps break up some tension or conflict and helps the group stay healthy. Yeah,
there's bad humor for sure. In a group setting, you don't want to get caught up in joking about everything or joking about things at the wrong time.
So in addressing unhealthy conflict, we have to look at the flip side of the coin, which is healthy conflict. And what do we do with that? And that's one thing that most of us are fairly underskilled in. Growing up in families where conflict's not addressed, or maybe it's too aggressive, it's maybe passive aggressive, maybe that was familiar to you, and we were talking about that a second ago. Mm-hmm. The truth is most families don't have skills to manage conflict well, and yet conflict is a reality in groups, in relationships, and we have to figure out ways to handle it or manage it well.
Yeah, and this next part is about active listening. Essentially, it is so important that we have good listeners in the group, and kind of the ground rules for active listening is really if you're not speaking, you're listening. You're not conjuring up, what you're going to throw out there next, or how to defend yourself, or how to, one up somebody. You're actually hanging on every word that person is saying. So, we want to teach our group members to do this and to pay attention to it. So a nice little disclaimer in the beginning of the group is good for this. So someone's expressing their feelings and their needs. It's important to them. It's our job, not only as facilitators, but as members of the group to sort of, like I said, hang on those words, listen to them. They're important, and then respond. And almost always, if you do that, your response is going to be much healthier than if you're sitting back thinking about what you're going to say next.
And sometimes when it's difficult to share emotions, it's helpful to have a little bit of a script. That can feel very awkward at times, but I think with practice, scripting can become more fluid and natural. But a helpful script to begin with, if you're especially describing or kind of expressing difficult emotions, would be, I feel blank. And if you're struggling to come up with the feeling word, you can look at a feeling chart or look at a list of feelings, but say, I feel such and such when you do this. And then in there you insert behavior. When you showed up to group late, for example, I felt frustrated when you showed up to group late. In the future, I'd like to maybe know if you're going to be late. That would help me. So then after you present the feeling and when you have that feeling, then you're asking for the person to maybe adjust or saying what you will do to adjust in order to manage that conflict.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, a lot of people have heard that script before. It's really popular to for not only counselors but just anybody who's trying to teach someone about how to get their feelings out in a healthy way. So a lot of people know it, but hardly anybody uses it.
Yeah,
and it's really hard to use. If you're not paying attention, if you're not focused on it. So that's also a nice little, if you feel the group is kind of getting a little sideways with that, a reminder every so often during the group to use that script so that, that the health and the dialogue is really kind of, not too finger pointing or harmful, venomous. Sometimes it can be. So
exactly. Yeah, I think it's funny too because it's helpful to be lighthearted when you're scripting because otherwise it can sound quite robotic and you can't quite make sense of it and everybody starts to laugh. And I don't suggest laughing in serious topics, but at the same time, when you're kind of laughing and learning a new skill, it helps everybody feel like they're on the same page.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just one more thing on that, because can you tell we're passionate about this part? A lot of times in groups, the folks get caught up in talking about their significant other.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of finger pointing and blaming and anger that comes out, and that's okay. But if you're using the script, it's just going to convey your message so much better, and that people aren't going to have the desire or tendency that most of us have to kind of pile on. Oh, that husband of yours is terrible, the way you talk about him, right? And it's not that females sound like that. Let me take... Hi, there's my female voice again. You knew it'd come out.
Sounds just like me.
That's... but at any rate, we want to really make sure that we're using that script so that we're not going in a direction or going a little sideways when that's our tendency.
Well, I think what we're trying to do is encourage people to get in touch with their own feelings and express those to other members of the group, because that's really where the connection comes. We can easily bond over complaining about other people. Mm-hmm. It's much harder to get in touch with your heart and what actually you're feeling.
Yeah.
And that is what's going to connect the group members and move you towards healthy communication.
That's it. You nailed it.
And I guess to add to that point, the next thing to really address is boundaries when it comes to this. And we've kind of been talking about that a little bit here, but it's so important when we're thinking about conflict. And boundaries has become a buzzword. Many people think of it as healthy. Other people hate the word boundaries. So I think it's important just to have a quick refresher on it and what they actually mean. I think when we don't like boundaries, it's typically because we felt somebody has put up boundaries against us and our behavior. And when we do enjoy boundaries, it's because they've protected us from something harmful. So I think one way of thinking about it, Cloud and Townsend are kind of the gurus of boundaries. They've written the book Boundaries, and their definition is a personal property line that marks those things for which we are responsible. In other words, boundaries define who we are and who we are not. So if you haven't read that book, it's an excellent additional resource, both in your personal relationships as well as ministry.
Yeah, and so a lot of us have had to work really hard on boundaries because it's just kind of foreign to us. But it's really important to remember that boundaries are for us, not necessarily to dictate what the other person should or should not be doing. So, I want to say that again. It's for us not to dictate is for us, but not to dictate what somebody else should or should not be doing. That's really an important part of it. And so if we can kind of convey that sentiment to the group members, and model that, it's hugely important. And I like this part too, where we don't, we can control what we can control in terms of boundaries. And that always reminds me of the serenity prayer, which states, God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, that is a really awesome way of saying, if I can't control that, there's, a boundary may not even be necessary because it is out of my control. But boundaries help you control the things that you can. And again, the last part of that, the wisdom to know the difference between the two.
Yeah, and really to even know what your boundaries look like, you have to really get in touch with what you need. So many times that's connecting with your own heart. What are my feelings? What are my body responses? Because those things help us answer the question about what we might need. And if we know what we need, then we know when we're sacrificing. So that way we know our sacrifices are a choice and not something we're doing without knowing it. And I think for caretakers, that's particularly important because we tend to sacrifice and think we're doing the right thing. But if we're not paying attention to our own self-care, our own soul care, we can be on the quick road to burnout and doing unhealthy things.
Really good point.
In a family setting, boundaries can look a lot of different ways. Terry's an extrovert from a huge, huge family. You might be able to pick that up in audio, but if you can't, you maybe can meet him someday in person. And although I love people, I tend to be a little bit more introverted. So over the years, we had to figure out how to manage family gatherings. It typically involves communication ahead of time, possibly driving separately, or even Terry going on his own to some of the events. How did we get there? Because that sounds like a fairly nice plan, but that came through a lot of discussions, a lot of experiences, and figuring out for me what I needed and set the limits for myself ahead of time while still being flexible and sacrificial and doing what Terry might like to do.
Well,
right?
That is true. Nailed it. With all that said, as facilitators, we do have to set boundaries. And that can be, one of the most difficult things to do in a group because you're just getting to know some of these people. And not only that, you feel responsible for them. And that's a big part of it. We feel responsible in that group, but we really need to understand that for the safety of the group and the stability of the group, boundaries sometimes need to be set. And so it's a kind of a harsh reality. But not only will you benefit from those boundaries, everybody in the group will too, because it really kind of maintains, that semblance of a good working group. So, someone, an example of that is when someone has missed more than two groups. This is always something that seems to pop up in the groups that I've run. I don't know about you, Roxy. It's
pretty common.
The missing of groups, and we tell folks, two is tops. One is somewhat disruptive already. Two is tops, but then someone comes in and says, I got to miss that third group. What do you do? What kind of boundary? What have you done, Rox? I'll just ask it straight out. What have you done when this has come up?
Well, it really depends on the context, because if somebody predicts ahead of time that they are going to miss a group and they're feeling really badly about it, and the group is able to talk about it and kind of prepare for that miss, that can make all the difference in the world. Let's say it's a family emergency that came up, and that's going to be their third time missing. Well, I think in that setting, you figure it out as a group and you find ways to be gracious about it and prepare. And I think if that can happen, then you're increasing safety. On the other hand, let's say it's an unpredictable thing and it just happened and there's 3 misses, and maybe there's some other signs that this person's just really not ready for the group. They are maybe not doing the homework. They are feeling too emotional. maybe the family emergency is that, but it's not, there's no end in sight to that family emergency. So then you have to start addressing whether the timing of the group is appropriate or not. And I think, like you had said in another section, that's a side conversation. Maybe a facilitator and a group member have that conversation. Is this the right time for you? And I think the goal in any of these conversations, whether somebody stays or whether somebody goes, is to increase safety.
Right.
And if you're not increasing safety, you're probably going awry. So it's really not about kick them out or keep them in. It's about increasing safety.
Right. And as much as you possibly can, making it a group decision too. And sometimes it is more of a facilitator's decision just because of the way it kind of unfolds. But if you can, in a safe way, keep it within the group, or at least include the group members. That's always nice too. But you'll probably know. I mean, there comes a point where somebody is missing, more than one, or they anticipate it, or they just are flaky. You'll know whether they're invested or not. You just kind of feel it, and especially with a co-facilitator talking about it. If both of you have the same spidey sense about the whole thing, it's probably time to take them aside, pull them aside and talk to them about it.
I totally agree. I just think too, going back to the healthy family dynamic, I mean, in including the group in decisions like that, or even having a discussion about it with your facilitator, maybe even in front of some of the group members, if that's appropriate, can really start modeling difficult conversations and how to move through them and make decisions. And it can empower each of the members. And when you're doing that, you're increasing safety. I mean, how many of us have been in a group that just feels totally unsafe? You might as well just be at a family reunion at that point. Yeah. So I think that's the whole point of these groups, is increasing safety.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
Not that all family reunions are bad.
No, mine are great.
So are mine.
Yeah.
And I think what we'd like to do now is kind of go revisit some of those questions about red flags and what happens in a group, and give you some ideas. And I think, to the point earlier, we're going to give you some suggestions about how to handle difficult group experiences, but we don't really want you to take this with just absolute certainty. Every single group is different. Every relationship's different. People have different personalities. So we don't want you to approach this question and answer section as a one-size-fits-all sort of remedy for how to manage difficult group situations. Hopefully it gives you some ideas, a springboard, and then you and your co-facilitator or your pastor or your clinician, other people in that support team, can work together to come up with the right solution for a group experience that's gone awry. So that's the disclaimer. And I think you're going to address the first one, Terry. What if a participant is talking too much?
Okay, let me
What do you
handle
do?
Well, we don't want to tell them to shut up, in other words, I joke.
Seems straightforward.
That's a little straightforward. I joke about that, but you would be surprised what sort of approach people take when this kind of thing happens. So a big part of this is really gaining the rapport and understanding who these folks are and where they're coming from, and maybe some of their, personality traits and dynamics. So if you know that, you'll know when to joke, you'll know when to be firm, you'll know when to pull aside. Those kind of things will come naturally because you are actually taking the time to get to know the person. But really what we want to do is use as much grace as possible while being firm. So that's a kind of a tricky combo platter right there, because grace is saying that I'm going to allow you sort of the comfort to do what you need to do to heal. But the firmness is saying that, but there are guidelines, there are parameters to that. So, an example would be, thanks for sharing, but we're running out of time. And I'd love to hear from Beth, before we leave. And so you're kind of saying, I love that you're sharing with us, but we need to shift it over here. And hopefully they don't take offense to that. And then, a side note, some people you're just not going to be able to sort of coddle or be kind to and gentle to enough, and they're going to take it offensively. A lot of these folks in the group are hurting. Most of them are hurting individuals that have had trauma and abuse. They're used to being treated poorly, right?
Yeah.
So even the most subtle of messages can be taken a bad way. So that's another part of this sensitivity.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's just, you're in it for the long haul. And so you might have an interaction like that and it goes awry. But I think if you're showing time and time again that you're consistent, that you're there for that person, that you want to keep understanding them and where they're coming from, that's about all you can do. And, even with all of that, sometimes those situations still kind of get tricky, but that's where the support system comes in.
That's right.
Your co-facilitator and others that are supporting that group.
Yeah. And which one of you has a better rapport with that particular person? That's a big
great.
part of it too. And that's a big part of, debriefing afterwards and processing afterwards or before the group. If Bill talks up, let me handle it because, I know Bill fairly well. He went to my church, blah, 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 right?
Yeah. Playing to your strengths as a facilitator.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So here's another one. What if a participant is talking too little?
Well, it goes back to your point about just knowing the group member. Are they feeling shut down? Would it be embarrassing for them to be called on? That's important to know. Maybe you address that one-on-one and say that you'd love to hear from them. And maybe ask if there's anything that would make the group feel a little safer for them to share. Give them a choice, him or her a choice. And, that might sound like, I noticed that you haven't shared much today. Would you like to share a few thoughts or feelings from today? Or would you rather wait? I think giving that choice is very important because you don't want to hammer somebody who's feeling shut down. You do want to create an invitation. If they prefer to wait, then maybe you could say, again, is there anything that would feel safe to share? So maybe you don't feel like answering about this particular exercise. Is there any other comment that you would like to make about the group?
So you're giving them a little room to kind of do something. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think inviting somebody to share a little bit, maybe you find out that they just can't really put into words what they're feeling or thinking. So maybe it's a matter of spending a little time on the side, determining what it is that they're feeling in the group and encouraging them to share that next time, just even in a sentence or two.
Yeah.
That way they're challenging themselves to move just a little bit, but not feeling hammered.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So another one that comes up all the time, and I think you address it in nuts and bolts too, but I think it comes up so often it's important to talk about again. What if participants don't do their homework?
Yeah, I love this one because this has happened a couple times in groups I've run. And a big part of this is that if they're not doing the homework, the other members of the group are going to know. They're just gonna know, whether they can see that there's actually nothing written down or not. They're gonna know,
right?
And so, and a lot of times, at least with my groups, my experience is that the person that's not doing the work will tell everybody that they haven't done the work.
Yep.
They'll just kind of come out and say, I didn't do the work. So and the trick becomes when they don't do the work. More than once, or consistently. And so, but we really want to watch with the shame messaging in that. It's important that we don't talk down to them because they're not doing what we are encouraging them to do. So maybe we just encourage them to do as much as possible, or we figure out what might be causing them not to do their work. Are there some problem solving sort of things that we can do? Do they need a separate notebook? Are they afraid of someone seeing it, et cetera, et cetera? I had a guy that didn't do his work, and I happened to have seen him before the group separately, individual counseling, and I knew we were taking a chance having him in the group because he was still in the middle of some stuff. Or, anyway, not to over-explain that, but in the group, he just kind of kept everything in, didn't do the work, and he said he was afraid of people seeing it. Well, really what he was trying to say is that I'm not there yet. And so we had a talk, we had a sidebar, and he said, you know what, you're right, I'm just not there, and I'll catch a next group.
Yeah.
And so, and another part about this is in a way to encourage people not only to do the work but to journal. One of the members in our group said one time, and it sticks with me, and this is probably like 7 years ago, he said, it's one thing to just have these thoughts in my head and have them circling around and, ping-ponging around my brain. And it's an entirely different thing when I write it down, because then it becomes real to me. And I thought, what a great way of saying that. So when you're doing these exercises in the book, if you can convey to the group members, this is a transition into making this real. This is a transition into making this not from the head, but from the heart. And that's a big part of it.
Yeah, it's just a whole nother step in movement and challenging yourself to express some of those things that have been rolling around in your head.
Yeah, exactly. So here's another one for you, Roxy. Okay. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
What if a group member is aggressive? Your favorite?
That is my favorite.
Yeah.
Not really. The first point for me is choose which facilitator is best skilled at handling this. And I think that's really helpful to just know right up front.
Yeah.
And then I think really it's important to try to de-escalate the situation by getting underneath the aggressive posturing. Is a participant feeling vulnerable? That may often be the case. And I know this might be different for guys groups and women's groups. I think for women, when they tend to be a little bit more aggressive, often there's a vulnerable emotion going on underneath. And that's true for men too, but sometimes it's very quick to get under those vulnerable emotions for women. Like, I'm noticing that you're feeling a little bit tense or anxious today. Is there anything else going on for you? And we've done that in groups before, and you just get right at it. And there's maybe a difficult family situation, or maybe they didn't get the homework, but they don't feel like announcing it like guys are comfortable doing. And, they just are feeling a little more awkward. So it's easier to get to those underlying emotions if you just kind of handle that right up front. And I think if it continues to escalate, it's important to get some space from the group. Walking is super helpful because that's going to, from a physical standpoint, really decrease all of that chemical reaction. If somebody's kind of aggressive, they're in fight mode. So they're going to have cortisol and all kinds of things going on and adrenaline, and you want to get some of that toned down. So sometimes walking outside can be a really helpful way to get that physical response de-escalated so that person's safe enough to join the group. So as some of you might be thinking, that's where it's important to have co-facilitators, because if one facilitator has to leave to help de-escalate a situation, or somebody who's having some really strong feelings, if there's just one of you, the rest of the group is going to feel abandoned and awkward. But if the other facilitator can pick up where that one left off, then both parties, the person who's been taken aside and the group, can feel safe.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So what if a group member shows up high, drunk, or over-medicated? I hate to say it, but it does happen. It
does happen. In fact, it happened to one of our members in our group. And I actually, as therapists, we kind of send a lot of our people or people from other therapists into these groups. So I actually had this guy as well as an individual client, and I knew that he had a drug issue, but he had been sober for 4 or 5 months, something of that nature. The longest length of sobriety he had in his adult life. So I felt like he was ready. He wasn't. He came in a couple times. I could tell that he was on, what his drug of choice is, marijuana. So I could tell there was something there, even though he was pretty good at hiding it. So I had to pull him aside and talk to him about it. And he was very open and honest about it. But we talked about, how that might be unsafe for the group, and how that's, if he's not all in it, with his whole mind and body, how can that, be for the other clients who might, or the other folks in the group that might be picking up on this? And what is he getting out of it, right? So, it's certainly, something that needs to be addressed. And if not addressed, it can be really super disruptive.
So it sounds like you took him aside and had that conversation and were just allowing him to make some decisions about the group. Did you end up addressing that with the group members once he decided that it wasn't the right timing for him?
We didn't disclose the drug use itself, but we just framed it in a way that let the group members know that he just wasn't quite ready. And
wasn't the right timing.
And that was his decision. Yeah, and it actually was his decision.
I think that was great. You gave everybody a lot of choice in that.
Yep.
Do you want to do one more?
Let's do one more of these. Yeah, here we go. Roxy, what if a group member needs mental health services? What do we do?
Well, I think it's important, again, to address that one-on-one, because your goal is to increase safety and not increase shame. So I think this goes to the point of being really well set up and supported before you start a group. So having professionals that your church or ministry consults with, ideally, they're familiar with Mending the Soul, or have even had additional training in Mending the Soul. They can check out the website if they haven't. I think having your church support evaluation and counseling for particular members, because sometimes you're just in it too far and then the information comes out. And so I think that's important to say to your maybe care ministry, what are the supports that the church has? I've got a number of members going through this group. Sometimes it comes out that they might need some additional mental health services. What kind of funding does a church have on that? What are the church policies in that regard? And I think that's important to know, because if you're going to open up a box and then you don't have ways to help it kind of sort itself back out with resources, then you have to decide whether or not it's the potential for damage is too great. So that's where you really want to do good screening with maybe active symptoms ahead of time. Active symptoms, I know that sounds clinical, but it's important to kind of address, is this person expressing suicidal thoughts where they're dangerous to themselves? Are they in the throes of a depression? Are they demonstrating dangerous eating disordered behavior where they're losing a ton of weight, or you hear some symptoms that you go, whoa, this is way over my head. It sounds like they're talking with a physician about this. Those are important things to note. Certainly psychotic symptoms where somebody's reality just doesn't seem to be there. They're experiencing voices or hallucinations. Aggressive behavior, not necessarily just that conflict that we were addressing earlier, kind of tension, but ongoing aggressive behavior or even physical acting out. And certainly, like to your point, current drug or alcohol abuse. So I think all of those things become red flags, and you have to really say and ask and talk with your co-facilitator about the appropriateness for a group at this point. And I would say, if in doubt, err on the side of safety, bump it up to a professional and maybe reevaluate for another group. And I love Tanya's voice on this. She always says it doesn't have to be a flat out no. It could be a no, not yet. Mm-hmm. And what are the supports that need to be in place for you for a group to really be the right timing? And that's really helpful.
And just to add just a little bit to that, so it's real important to not only address. Let me back up a little bit. It's okay to be confused on this, because mental health is very convoluted potentially. So it is okay to not know what the heck you're doing or not to know exactly where to go. But that confusion gives you a message. I probably need to do something about this. I'm confused for a reason. But you definitely want to screen it with the person themselves first, because if you're referring somebody out before you have checked in with them or gotten their permission, you could definitely do not only the group harm, but that any kind of rapport that you've tried to gain with this particular person. So do what you can, front line, talk to that person. If you're still confused or fearful about a mental health issue or potential condition, then you take that next step, and that's to contact a professional. And as much as you can, allow that person to know what you're doing. If they're a danger to self or others, you don't necessarily have to let them know. But anything outside of that, you want to let them know that you're seeing something that doesn't feel good, doesn't feel healthy. What if we tried this? What about talking to that person? Would you be okay with that? As much as you can, do that, because then you're supporting from underneath, not on top. And
that's such a good point. And I think, even if you're feeling nervous about saying something like that, that gives you a chance to address some of those communication strategies that we've been talking about, and being appropriately assertive and expressing what you're observing. Yeah. And that's really a skill that facilitators have to be practiced at, because it will come up every week.
And just to normalize it too, even as clinicians, we see things in groups that confuses us. I mean, we don't know, every nuance of mental health. We just don't. And so, and we're trained. If you're not trained, it's really hard to pick up on some of these things. So, don't be afraid to be confused or to ask questions. That's really important, because most times you're not going to be able to kind of nail it down real easily. So,
yeah, I think it's such a good point. It's really helpful to just go into situations like that with humility and just vulnerability, and be okay with asking for help. And I think at this very last part, what we'd like to do is have you refer to your notes and go back to that original example of unhealthy conflict or tension that you came up with at the beginning of the webinar, and just take some time to answer the following questions when the webinar ends. And take the time. I really encourage you. A lot of times after the end of a webinar, you go, oh, I don't think this is really that important. But if you're planning on facilitating a group, I think closing the loop on some of these questions will be really, really helpful. So given our discussion, what would you have done differently in that situation? Maybe what did you need? That was one of our big points in boundaries. Did you need some physical space? Did you need some time? Were you feeling emotionally unsafe? Did you need language for what you were thinking and feeling at the time? And then knowing what you needed, what would have been an appropriate boundary for yourself? And for that group, if you were responsible for that group, what would have been an appropriate boundary for that group? If you weren't responsible for the group, maybe put yourself in some leadership shoes, like a facilitating part of that group. What would you have done differently? And then after you process that original experience, take some time to fill out this quick reference guide. This is also in your notes, and this is really important before you start a group. And I would look at it like a boundary. Mm-hmm. So this is your boundary. It's your upfront discussion and kind of processing about what you will do in a difficult group experience. So who is my co-facilitator? Name and number. That seems obvious, but that's important to write down. Who's my ministry leader who maybe oversees the group? Who's the pastor that I can go to consult with and oversees this ministry? Who are the mental health professionals in my area who are familiar with our church and our ministry? What is our local mental health crisis line? A lot of times a quick Google search will give that to you, and I would actually test it ahead of time. Don't be afraid to call these numbers and actually see who gets on the line and say, I'm leading a group at my church, and I just wanted to make sure that this crisis line worked. And they'll tell you if it's working or not. What is our local police department's non-emergent phone number? You look it up for the city. And then what is the child abuse hotline for our area and state? The name and number. And of course, the end all, 911.
Yes.
So,
I think if I were to kind of cap this, it would be similar to what we were just talking about. And with difficult situations, with things that might seem a bit out of our scope, I think it's really it's paramount. It's more than important. It's just it needs to happen that you understand that you are there facilitating the group, and things happen that might be beyond you, and that's okay. You have people to help you with that. Don't go into this thinking that you have to solve all the problems and help everybody, and it's your job. Your end goal is to make sure that everybody is completely tucked in and made safe. It is a team effort, and we were talking earlier about you have those clinicians, you have those pastors and other folks in ministry to kind of lean on through this stuff. So, default is to ask for help. Default is to say, I don't know. Default is to say, this is really confusing to me. And if it goes beyond you and the co-facilitator, that's probably a good thing.
I think that's a great wrap up. Thanks, Terry.
Thanks, Roxy.